Everybody, good evening. Thank you all so much for being here this evening to launch Women and the Decade of Commemorations. So many times during the process of editing and publishing this book, which has been in the work for 4 years now, I looked forward to the time when I would be able to express my gratitude to contributors in person. On the one hand, while I heartily wish that we could have launched this volume live to enable me to do that, one of the unexpected advantages of an online launch is that so many of the contributors have been able to make it, and from so many different places, from all around the island of Ireland, from Denmark, from England, even Australia and New Zealand. And a special shout out to Diane joining us from Melbourne, who's actually agreed to speak as well at this time of the morning. So thank you all for joining us from different time zones as well. One of the lovely things about editing a book like this is that you're given the experience of so many other minds and many forms of expertise. So to Síobhra Aiken, Maeve Casserly, Ellie Davies, Linda Connolly, Donna Gilligan, Diane Hall, Roisín Higgins, Sinéad Kennedy, LauraMcAtackney, Mary McAuliffe, EveMorrison, Brenda O'Connell, Sonja Tiernan, Diane Urquhart, Finnuala Walsh, and Margaret Ward. Thank you all so very much for committing your work to this book. When we say that a book takes a particular amount of time to come to fruition, what we don't normally add is that so much life swims around it. People begin new jobs, they move countries, they finish PhDs, they deal with many joys and losses, and they can even find themselves, one and all, caught up in a global pandemic. So I would like to begin by thanking all of the writers who contributed not just impressive and important research, but also their time, their life space, a part of themselves to this book through many different circumstances. So thank you. Another lovely aspect of editing a project like this one is that because you're only contributing one small piece of the puzzle yourself, it's possible to genuinely praise the book and say how wonderful you think it is. This is a book that I'm tremendously proud to have been a part of and to have sent out into the world. And that feeling is a tribute to the incredible work of the writers I've just named. It's also a sign of the work of all of those at Indiana University Press, particularly Jenica Baines, who set in motion the idea for this series on Irish culture, memory, and place, of which I'm a co-editor with Guy Biner and Ray Cashman. So my warmest thanks to Jenica, Guy, and Ray, with whom it continues to be such a pleasure and inspiration to work. This volume was inspired by a series of keynotes, symposia, and roundtable discussions held at Maynooth University in 2016 as the university's Centennial Commemorations Program. I'm grateful to the university and the University Commemorations Committee for its generous support of that series, as well as to the Peace and Reconciliation Fund and the Irish Research Council for generously supporting this work. While there are too many Maynooth colleagues to name who made all of these events possible, I would like to thank Dr. Jennifer Redmond, Amanda Bent, and Tracy O'Flaherty in particular for their work during back in that distant time where we all worked in real life. The public events out of which this book arose aimed to diversify approaches to the Decade of Commemorations, focusing intentionally on women and the Decade of Commemorations as a corrective to the national conversation to that point, seeking to showcase the scholarly and creative endeavors of women working in an Irish scholarly cultural context, and to initiate discussion about their counterparts of a century ago. Finally, they aimed to consider the ways in which the Decade of Centenaries had the potential to limit discussion and debate about events and commemorations perceived to lie outside of its remit, from the ways in which women in the north of Ireland contributed to the revolutionary period to the rights afforded to women in contemporary Ireland. The recent work that has been produced by historians, archaeologists, sociologists, Irish language scholars, literary and cultural critics, all represented, I'm happy to say, in this volume, has, to my mind, changed the landscape of Irish commemorative practice, pushing away from what I call in my introduction to this book, oblivious remembrance, and towards a more consciously engaged effort to commemorate inclusively. And of course, this is one which we can and should look to continuously improve on. Tonight, we have the opportunity to hear from almost all of the contributors to this book in 4 panel discussions of approximately 15 minutes each. For our first panel, Mary McAuliffe, Linda Connolly, LauraMcAtackney, and Finnuala Walsh will respond to the ways in which the Decade of Commemorations might have changed history in the past with regards to women. In our second panel, Margaret Ward and Donna Gilligan will discuss suffrage and its representation in Irish history. Our third panel will see Dianne Hall and Síobhra Aiken discussing the challenges of transnational research and considerations of diaspora. And our final panel of the evening, Brenda O'Connell and Ellie Davies reflect on issues of the contemporary moment. So without further ado, I will pass you over to the first panel. And I believe, Linda, you are going to speak first.
Yes, no pressure. Thank you, Oona. I'm just going to start with some brief remarks at the opening. Really, I'm going to show example by not speaking for too long. But I do want to really first thank you, Oona. Your comments are very generous to the writers, but I work in the same building as you, and I know you, and I know how hard you have worked on this collection. It is phenomenal, and I think you have provided something that will be a very rich resource for many years to come. So thank you, and also the Department of English, a department I know for a long time, which you're a part of, and to welcome Professor LauraMcAtackney to Maynooth as well. I think she's here somewhere, I saw her name. And just to say that I think this is very indicative of the kind of work that's done in your department. So I think my chapter is actually the last chapter, even though I'm speaking first, and it is reflecting back on the decade so far, but I'm going to just start in keeping with this theme of the revolution with just a few remarks. And I think what this collection, and I suppose it really reflects my own interest in interdisciplinarity and the way in which we can move across different disciplinary perspectives to interrogate questions of commemoration, history, and memory, and in particular to tease out those concepts and from different vantage points, and to understand how they relate to the question of gender specifically. And I was thinking this evening from when we started in 2016, I remember the penultimate statement by the churches, the religious orders, the churches at the time, asking that the commemoration of 1916 be pluralist and inclusive. But I wondered at the time to what extent that extended to the whole question of women and commemoration. So as we saw, as the decade progressed, we did see what you refer to as commemorative practice, but also what I would call the process of commemoration taking a very gendered turn, if you want to use that phrase. So things like, for instance, the inclusion of women as keynotes, the amount of time they had on panels, etc. These are, I suppose, were all practices that suggested that this was a gendered process. So in a way, it was a bit like, I suppose, that notion of speaking back to the centre, that I think really what you have captured is a large group of scholars working on women who were going to adopt, I suppose, a critical stance to the commemorative process, but also to the practices which were impacting us, if you like, as working academics and intellectuals who have a strong voice and part to play in the commemoration. So some of that, I suppose, is about feminist politics, but it is also about providing a feminist perspective on commemoration and what commemoration is. In terms of, I suppose we had to work hard to get our work across, and a number of projects have emerged, and this is one of them. Often I turn to poetry to make sense of these things. I just received yesterday Van Bolen's new collection, which I'm not going to read, but I'm just going to quote something I wrote about in the Irish Times a few weeks ago, the late Van Bolen, and I take my title, Women's Troubled and Troubling Relationship, from one of her talks that she gave, an interview. And Van Bolen was acutely aware of what I call the troubled place that women hold in Irish culture and history. In 2007, she talked about how, as a young poet, she began to see what she called a huge rift in Ireland between the past and history. And she distinguished very much those two things. As time went on, she said, it was plain to me that the past was a place of whispers and shadows and vanishings, and that history was a story of heroes. So this, I suppose, established history that evolved over time was reinforced effectively by a gender hierarchy, including in academic departments, where gender inequality persisted for decades and still does to this day. Many women were never promoted, certainly very few have been promoted to the level of professor. So the narrative of the Irish Revolution then, which is what we're discussing here in this panel, has been in effect, I suppose, for much of the last 100 years, a chronology of great men and male militarism. Now, much of that has been challenged and transformed in recent years, but it's still, I suppose, there's still a presumption that women have played either a subsidiary role or no role at all. So they're there, if you like, to serve the overall narrative. They exist alongside the narrative. Whereas I would suggest that women both shaped the revolution and were also profoundly impacted by it. So there's both agency and experience at the same time. And it's very important that this is positioned as equal, as alongside that narrative that predominated, as I said, for much of the 20th century. So significant studies of women's role and experience, both what they did and what happened to them, in simple terms, in revolutionary movements, have explored the gendered nature of conflict. And that, in a sense, is partly, I think, what has been, is part of this process of interrogating commemoration. So I think I leave it at that, Oona, and just let some others maybe come in at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I think, Laura, were you going to speak next?
Thank you. And thanks again also to Oona for organising all those great workshops a couple of years ago, and also for bringing the publication through, which I know is so hard, just trying to get all those edited pieces together. So the book is fantastic. I've loved reading all the chapters, and I want to thank everybody else for all their contributions. And I just am going to spend a couple of minutes just to talk about the background to my paper. So I was working on an archaeological project. So I'm one of the non-historians in the book. I was working on Kilmainham Jail as a graffiti project, recording the graffiti from the Civil War period mainly, but also the majority of that graffiti was also from women. And what I became really interested in as we moved through the commemorative period was how many ordinary women left their mark behind on those walls, but didn't leave their mark behind in public consciousness, and why that happened. And so I decided to take the opportunity, and I was so delighted to get this opportunity to write about one of those women. I really wanted to spend some time actually going into depth about some ordinary person rather than one of the big revolutionaries or the people that we know a lot about. And so I used the story of Brady Halpen, who was a Dubliner who was born in 1902 and died in 1987. And I think her significance is in her insignificance, because I was interested in looking at her because I found a small collection of her papers which had been passed to Kilmainham Jail's archive after she died in 1987 in New York. So I really started with this story by starting at the end and then looking backwards. The fact that we had these papers was only because her family, who knew nothing about her exploits during this period, found all these papers under her bed in New York after she died as the kind of matriarchal maiden aunt. And they found all sorts of papers, like tiny, tiny pieces of fragments that she had kept in a case all this time and had never spoke about anything she had done. And what I found was interesting was there was an article written about this the year after, in 1988, and the family refrain that continued over and over again was, why didn't she say anything? And I really wondered about that, like, why did some women not say anything, as well as, but at the same time keep all this material? So what I found in their collection was autograph books, there was military archive records, there was personal letters dating from her time in Kilmainham Jail and the North Dublin Union, the whole way through to letters up into 1976, whenever she was an old lady as well, and she was writing to women who she'd been in prison with 50 years before. I found her in the graffiti whenever I went to look for one tiny, tiny piece in the West Wing. And she was also in Republican papers. Like I noticed there was a paper from 1924 from the Dublin Republican Prisoners Employment Bureau, which again spoke to the fact that she was having a difficult time getting a job. And that's what one thing I always was interested in. What happened to these women afterwards, these ordinary women who didn't have a family to fall back on, or who were ostracized or didn't have anywhere else to go. And her story took her to Canada in the 1930s and then on to New York, where she lived a very full life but never talked about what she did at home. And so what I wanted to do was use these pieces of paper, these pieces of graffiti, and anything else I could find, just to try and piece together some of her story, that we have that now in this book that otherwise would not have been there. And I was really interested in focusing on these stories that are not just of elite women, but also of ordinary women. So thank you for that opportunity, Oona.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's one of the fascinating pieces. I mean, from the time I heard you talk about the graffiti, it's such a riveting idea of these literal traces that are left. So thank you. Mary, do you want to go ahead?
Always one who forgets to unmute. And I want to echo all those thanks to you, Oona, for inviting me firstly to speak at those seminars you held in Maynooth, and then to participate in the book. And I'm absolutely delighted to be among such great scholars in the book and with your own work on the introduction. And I know how much work you put into it. And it was really interesting for me to be able to write about the Decade of Centenaries, as my involvement in it really started with the Rosie Hackett Bridge campaign in 2013. And there was an unknown woman. And that was a very interesting moment for me in my research, and the realization that there was still so much work to be done about these women. And to have that successfully named after Rosie Hackett, a young Jacobs factory worker, a member of the Irish Women's Workers' Union, working class Dublin woman, who had been a member of the Irish Citizen Army, and yet disappears from the records really after 1917. The last real official record we get of her is the first anniversary of James Connolly's death, when she and 3 or 4 others, including Helena Maloney, barricaded themselves into Liberty Hall and put out a big banner saying James Connolly murdered, May 1916. Yet she spent another 50 years working within the trade union movement. And this was the sort of material that was coming more and more to the fore through the digital archives we were now beginning to get access to, which began to reveal, on top of the great work that had been done since the 1980s by people like Margaret and others, the broader histories of perhaps the unknown women. We knew quite a bit about the leadership. Now we were beginning to get the membership of the Cumann na mBan, of the Irish Citizen Army, and the various organisations, and women, unorganised women as they were called, who weren't involved in any of those groups, but were also part of the revolutionary movement. It also allowed me to write about one figure that I've been fascinated by for a very long time, and that was Elizabeth O'Farrell, of course, Nurse O'Farrell. And here is a little memento I got in Connolly books. And of course, she's in her nurse uniform. And for me, this is the problem with how, even when women are getting written back into the narrative, they're constructed in a certain way, in that very unthreatening, caring, nurturing role, the nurse narrative. And that's what I write about in my chapter, how that nurse narrative has been, while it was part of what the women did, and a very important part of what the women did, it wasn't their only role. And that was the only role that was acceptable and allowable in many of the narratives, the mainstream narratives, really until the 1980s, inspired by second wave feminism, to dive deeper into what women's experiences and contributions were. The thing is, Elizabeth O'Farrell wasn't a nurse in 1916. She doesn't actually become a midwife until a couple of years later, in the early 1920s. She was a feminist activist. She was a militant nationalist. She was a trade union activist. She was many things, but she wasn't a nurse. And that dominant image of her in her nurse uniform, rather than in the uniform of the Irish Citizen Army, or with her Red Cross bib on, obviously, dominates the image. And that has been very, very difficult to dislodge. And really, that's what I talk about. We are still dislodging that. In 2016, as the commemorations began, newspaper report after newspaper report were absolutely thrilled that the women were now going to get commemorated, that they were becoming central to the story. And again, the argument being that they weren't until 2016. And of course they were. They were always there. They were always being written about. There were many, multitude of books in which these women were written about, both the leadership women and more the ordinary women. But the nurse narrative has proved very difficult to shift from public consciousness. I think it's beginning to go now. I think people are beginning to realize that there were women who were snipers, who were intelligence gatherers, who were scouts, who were at every single event that happened. Today is the anniversary of the Headford ambush in County Kerry, in which a trainload of soldiers was ambushed at Headford Junction by the East Kerry, the number 2 Kerry Brigade and the East Kerry Brigade, in which 2 IRA men were killed and either 7 or 9 soldiers. There's a dispute as to which. And that ambush only happened because the Cumann women had given the local IRA information about the train timetable and who was on the train and when it was coming into Headford. And afterwards, they helped deal with the wounded IRA men and then organised the military funeral for the 2 dead IRA men. And there's one incident that happened on one day, this day 100 years ago. And so this weaving in of women's contributions and women's experiences is changing the way revolutionary history is being written and needs to be written. And this book will be a major contribution to that. And thank you very much for pulling it together.
Thank you, Mary. Finnuala, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Oona, for putting this book together and for inviting me to contribute a chapter to it. I was writing my chapter in late 2018, early 2019, and it was I'm a First World War historian, so I was writing it just after the centenary of the armistice, having come, to the end of sort of a very busy 4 years of centenary work. And so it was, like, as Mary said, sort of an opportunity to sort of sit back and reflect on that period and what it was like to be writing a history of women of that period during the centenary times, and there was so much focus on it. I first became interested in women's experience in the First World War in Irish context just over a decade ago when I was completing my undergrad. And it's very apparent to me that gender was a very important category for analysis in the international historiography of the war, with lively debates taking place around the issue of whether the war represented a watershed for women's rights, whether it was emancipation, whether there was a backlash, all these sort of interesting discussions taking place. But in the Irish history of the First World War, women were barely visible. And when they were mentioned, it was typically at, highlighting their invisibility in a sense. Keith Jeffrey in 2000 memorably referred to historically hidden Ireland, referring to women's participation in the war. In 2008, Katrina Clear referred to it as women being in the historical shadow. And there was a sense that women's war story for Ireland was doubly marginalised due to the complex relationship between the Irish state and Irish society with Ireland's participation in the war. So for a long time, there wasn't much engagement with Irish participation in the First World War, and academic interest in it remained somewhat limited. And so women's participation in that wasn't seen as something of particular interest or particular relevance. And this was still very much the case when I began my research in 2011. It was seen as something where there wasn't going to be a huge amount of scope. People assumed that I was really working on the Easter Rising or the War of Independence, and that there was going to be a limited number of women who did anything of interest. And I started my research in the way that many of us do at Women's History, of looking for the women who did things, looking for women who left a mark in a sense, who left behind records, who had some active role. But what I ended up then trying to do was writing something about a much broader range of women, the women who just were trying to go about their ordinary lives, who were trying to just get by, just survive. And what I realized was that the war reached into the domestic spaces, and for women, couldn't be ignored. It wasn't something that they had a choice over to do their bit or not to do their bit. It was something that was pervasive, that impacted on their day-to-day existence. And from what I was studying, I realized that, you know, adding women into the story, you know, it wasn't just an additional, you know, oh, here's an interesting chapter on women now, that this, you know, uncovering the home front experience and dynamics on the home front, thinking about politicization of the everyday, that this could transform our understanding of how the war affected Ireland, but also gender relations at the time. And for me, I felt very important that this then become part of the wider story of women during this period of, you know, great immense change and significant discourses around what women's role should be in society. It was a much broader story than a sort of a initially conceived of a narrow story of, you know, Red Cross nurses and munitions workers and so forth, women who could fit into specific categories of doing their bit. And for this chapter, what I wanted to try and do was reflect on how women themselves articulated their experience of the war, how they themselves understood what they did, how it affected them, and how this was reflected in their writings, both at the time and afterwards, and the various issues that impact on those memories and on that sense of, you know, what they conceive to be service, what they conceive to be sacrifice, how they understood all of that. And then to think about gendered natures of commemoration of the war, how women, how what they did was remembered or forgotten, and to what extent it's been included in the commemorative process. And I ended the chapter on a fairly optimistic note about how, you know, there's been this rapid sea change in how women's war story has been written, has been included. You know, there really has been a real difference in the past 10 years over, you know, women being included in exhibitions, in school books, in history books, in conferences. And, you know, it seemed like a very positive place for where this this was going. 2 years on, I'm a little bit more skeptical, perhaps, that some of the centenary work is being sort of relegated as being, well, we did that for 4 years, we did that for that amount of time, and we don't actually really care that much about the war or about women, whatever. We've done our bit. And so at this point, I feel it's really important that we start thinking about, you know, how do we make sure that women's experiences are not just something that we talk about in rooms with ourselves, but, you know, do have that impact on, you know, that master narrative of history, and that it is transformed by this, that it isn't a case of adding women in, but, you know, changing the narrative from the outset. And I think, you know, with the war as well, it is a sense of integrating that history into the wider period of this time, and not just boxing it off into sort of as that there are different women who did different things, and that's not something, you know, we need to talk about when we think about the Irish state post-independence and so forth, because it is all part of the same story. You know, issues around women's morality, gendered relations, separate spheres, you know, so much of the issues that come to dominate the 1920s and 1930s, you know, are highlighted in the war and become issues of concern to a greater extent then. And so it is an added piece that perhaps, you know, can teach us a lot from being put back into the story. And that's where I think, you know, collections like this are so important in just bringing all of this together, allowing us to reflect on these histories, and, you know, reminding us, if anybody could think otherwise, that women's history, you know, is very active and very live, and that there's huge amounts to be done, but huge amounts being done already.
Thank you so much, Finnuala. I mean, I think the comments made by all four speakers, I think, raise a lot of questions that perhaps we can come back to at the end in terms of thinking about this as a whole today and as a group, because it strikes me that no matter what discipline you're all coming from, and we have 3 disciplines represented there amongst the 4 speakers, there is this very powerful sense of this need to rewrite narratives or to challenge narratives. That's really interesting when we take into account how different all of our perspectives are disciplinarily. And I think that that's something that we can hopefully come back to in the questions. If it's okay, I'm going to go on to our next panel, which is on suffrage. We have both Donna and Margaret speaking on this. I'm not sure, Donna or Margaret, if each of you have a preference as to who would like to speak first.
I think Donna, because she comes first in the book, and I think, you know, it makes sense in terms of what she's talking about and I'm talking about. That's okay.
Yep, that's fine. Just to begin, I suppose, by echoing everybody and thanking Oona for her work. I'm so proud to be a part of this publication, so thank you very much for that. I suppose to talk about my chapter in the book, I am from the same discipline as Laura. I'm an archaeologist, but I specialise in work with museums. And my chapter was really about my work in tracing the visual and material culture of the Irish suffrage movement. So how this all kind of came about, I suppose back in 2016, being aware that we had a very significant commemoration of 100 years since Irish women first won partial vote was coming up for museums, and obviously we're in the thick of the decade of centenaries. I became interested in trying to find out what material there was for display and what museums were planning to do. And I suppose what prompted it was the fact that I've worked in museums for years and years, and I've never actually come across a suffrage object in the collections or have seen a permanent exhibition on suffrage in Ireland. So that really was what started me. And I suppose what came of that was really highlighting the fact that very little material from this period of history has been collected by museums and national institutions. It's not, I suppose, a huge shock, because coming from the museum background, I would say, and most people who work in museums would agree, that the role of women in museum collections and museum display has always been very limited, and you know that there have been huge gaps in the narrative where women have been left out. Often that is done as a result of lack of items to display. Women's history in museums, often that you'll see that it's connected to things like craft or domestic activity rather than political material, or some of the material that I did deal with in my research. But I suppose I was very conscious of the fact that Irish suffrage was a huge movement, and museums having very little material that might feel the need to maybe not carry out an exhibition or maybe not highlight that part of history because of the lack in their collections. And I thought that was really something that couldn't be allowed to pass. So I spent about 2 to 3 years trying to source as many surviving items from Irish suffrage from museums and private collections, and to try and put together, I suppose, maybe a little bit of a better history of what that period was like and the enormity of it, how many women were involved in it, the scale of it, the political achievements involved, because I was very concerned that if it was overlooked by museums, it would almost be a way of saying to the public that it was something that was unimportant, or maybe that there weren't that many Irish women involved with it. So yeah, I suppose overall, looking at suffrage in Irish history in museums, it has been very poorly exhibited. The few times that it has been dealt with in Irish museums have been small temporary exhibitions, one-off events. It hasn't really been included in a permanent narrative, which for such a big part of our national story is very disappointing. So the challenge is, I suppose, to try and have museums confront this, that we realise that there are items that haven't been collected that represent women's history in the past, and that's something that we need to be looking at rectifying, and also for the future that it's something we need to be correcting. One of the things that always makes me laugh, a lot of people might have come across the story of Michael Collins' slippers, which came into the public arena there recently. And it was something I always found very amusing, because the fact, I always thought if it was 50 years ago and somebody had come into the museum with a pair of Hannah Skeffington slippers or Meg Connery slippers, and they came to a curator and said, would you like to accession these for your collections? I really think it's unlikely that they would have taken them in. But because of this prevailing great man narrative, these simple items that are connected in any way to a male entity can be collected. But a lot of the material that was connected to the women of the suffrage movement, the vast majority of it was collected by one woman herself, which is Hannah Sheehy Skeffington. And she didn't necessarily collect them in the form of a shrine or with the idea that she was going to preserve history. A lot of the stuff was kept in her house, but quite a large part of it was only recovered after her death. And that we're obviously, like, we're hugely lucky that we were able to retrieve that material. But even with that material that has been maintained, it's still not on permanent display for the kind of important items that came from that really significant person from history. So I suppose, yeah, well, you know, museums are changing. It's a slow change. There needs 100 years of good material culture that represents Irish women's history, and that does need to be rectified. That's something that needs to be continually worked on. There are changes being made. I know particularly in the National Museum, Brenda Malone is doing some great work in contemporary collection, particularly with items around the repeal movement. But it's ongoing, and we need to redress the balance here in terms of the items that are collected for Irish women's history. And I think that's another reason why a publication like this one today is so important in keeping that to the fore and keeping it prominent. So that's me.
Margaret?
Thank you, Una, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to write about suffrage and to be able to do it on an all-Ireland basis. I'm really grateful to you and very pleased to be in a book with so many great other contributions. And Donna did a fantastic job in the period leading up to 2018 in assembling as much of the material culture of suffrage as was possible. And I know from our correspondence at that time how hard she worked in trying to extend her reach and trying to get people to donate. And it's been something, I think, that has gradually grown. I mean, her exhibition was well worth looking at, and it's a shame that, you know, it's not there for people still to see. It came up to Lisbon, and quite often it's individual curators then, I think, who are committed to that. So the Lisbon Linen Museum, because it also is the home of a militant suffragette, Lillian Metcher, they were able to link all of that to her home. But it's as Donna's talking about it, it's the temporary nature of all of that. So my chapter was looking at how suffrage was commemorated, not just during 2018, but the whole centenary of women getting the vote, and how suffrage was commemorated before that, how suffragists themselves tried to map themselves out, other than Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and the fact that she kept so much of the artefacts and the culture. But what we can see, I think, is very significant, that in all cases it's women, both women 100 years ago and women now, who've been the instigators of doing that. So that, for example, if you look at the bench in Stephen's Green to mark the contribution by Thomas and Anna Haslam, it was paid for by a broad coalition of suffragists, militant and non-militant, nationalist and unionist. They got a big committee together and got this, you know, lovely bench sculpted by Albert Power. And then there was another bench for Louis Bennett. I think there's a whole thing you could say about why benches for women, you know, something for women, you know, to repose on in a park. But later on, what we've had now for this centenary, we finally got blue plaques. So we have the plaque on Dublin Castle that commemorates the first smashing of windows by Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and Hilda Webb. But, you know, why have we got that? And that's because Micheline Sheehy Skeffington, Hannah's granddaughter, who, you know, were really very much in the debt of, who's so committed to keeping the suffrage legacy going, that she was the one that made the application to Dublin City Council. And to their credit, they took up that very enthusiastically, and it was them that suggested that there should be a suffrage reenactment of the window smashing, etc. But also another plaque in Greystones, which commemorates the first militant act, the heckling of Chief Secretary Birrell, again by Hannah, but also by Hilda Webb. This was an initiative of Rosemary Rochter, who's a member of the Women's History Association of Ireland. She's also a local historian in Greystones. So neither of those would have been something that the state itself thought was noteworthy. So if it hadn't been those initiatives, we wouldn't have them. And when it comes to thinking of Constance Markievicz, who is so important as the first woman to be elected in 1918, you know, why is she commemorated? Why was she commemorated in a more official sense? I think it's complicated. I don't think it was particularly a gendered moment, but much more a recognition of Sinn Féin triumph and the formation of Dáil Éireann. It's also, I would say, when I'm looking at how Westminster then recognised Markievicz, it's a kind of post-colonial moment of superiority for the Irish, because they were able then to use that opportunity to bequeath a portrait of Markievicz, who was, after all, a woman who not only didn't take a seat in Westminster, but who said she'd never take an oath of loyalty to a government she meant to overthrow. And it's an interesting political dynamic between Ireland and Britain when it comes to the election of Markievicz. But also in the book, I use the insights of Guy Byner and his fantastic book when he talks about territorial partition, which introduces separate, mutually exclusive memorial rituals as a way of looking at the north of Ireland and the social forgetting of the election campaign of Winifred Carney, who was the other Sinn Féin woman standing for election in 1918. In 2018, Unionists found it impossible to give due recognition to her. And when it was a motion in Belfast City Council that a statue of Carney should be erected in the grounds of City Hall, the unions would only consider that if the statue was also a statue of her husband, George McBride, a veteran of the Somme, who was a socialist, but he was also a staunch unionist. And that parity of esteem means that the kind of gendered nature and the political definition of Carney as a socialist Republican gets completely lost in terms of, you know, this marriage of the ostensible enemy and that kind of reconciliation narrative. And then I also looked at the memorial rituals in Britain, because it was at a time when you had a very right-wing government headed by a female Prime Minister, Theresa May. What is memorialisation? Does it have to be the right kind of memorialisation? So there was a big debate on having a statue of a suffragette in the grounds of Westminster, and the Pankhursts and the militant campaign were absolutely sidelined, and there was not going to be anything about them. So it was Millicent Fawcett, the non-militant leader, and also, by the way, a woman who opposed Home Rule. It's a terrific statue, and Gillian Waring, the sculptor, subverts, I think, government intentions by including the Courage Calls to Courage Everywhere banner, which is part of Fawcett's speech after the death of Emily Davison. But it's still an attempt, I would say, by the state to sanitise the suffrage movement. But that comes back to Ireland. Ireland has no similar statue. We don't have, if that's taken as a mark of official recognition. But, you know, when you look at the Irish State's calendar of events for 2018, and I was going back at the catalogue, it promised a symposium to explore the development of a new monument to revolutionary women. And I was going to be asked to speak at this symposium, which was cancelled twice, and then, you know, it's been dropped. And I'd ask the question now, where is the symposium and where is the monument? You know, there is more to do. I think the Irish state was able to pay lip service by saying, of course, we're going to acknowledge women in 2018, but I think breathed a sigh of relief when it was other people who did that acknowledgement, and they still, I think, have to step up to the mark. And why haven't they done anything? So I think that the whole question of suffrage and commemoration as a specifically gendered topic still brings in lots of questions about the role of the state and how it views women. And just to finish, I was thinking of President Higgins when he unveiled the plaque in Dublin Castle. He'd obviously thought about this gendering of history and talking about this narrow historiography. He said one with a militaristic bias that could easily carry a chauvinistic bias. And we still have that, and that's the challenge of all of us in this book.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I think, again, both of your talks raise so many questions for me, despite having read the essays about, the fact that Donna's work is absolutely attempting to gather a material that otherwise has been lost, literally lost. And then when you raise that question then about the role of the state in commemorating, if we don't have those actual objects or the artifacts, then how do we commemorate? And it becomes the classic, where Wolfetone's statue was not, where it's the constant absence of commemorative acts or presences that we're all trying to counter in our work, I think. So thank you so much. Síobhra and Dianne, again, Dianne, just for those of you who might have joined us afterwards, Dianne is in Melbourne. I'm just in awe that you can actually get up and speak at that hour of the morning. Which I don't know which one of you would like to speak first, but please feel free to just go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll jump in if that's okay, Oona. So I'm really happy to be on this panel with Diane, and we'll be discussing for the next few minutes, I suppose, the question of memory in the diaspora and women's, I suppose, the commemoration of women's activism in the diaspora. And I know this is something that Diane has been working on for many years in terms of recuperating the history of the Irish in Australia. So it's really an honour to be on this virtual panel with Diane. But I suppose what I'll do to start off is just to say how I got involved with this project, and that was because of a tweet that Oona put up on Twitter looking for chapters on women in the diaspora. And I think that already speaks to maybe that oblivious forgetting that there already was a gap in the narrative that needed to be filled. And it was just really coincidental, I think, that I had just started my PhD, and it's not actually I suppose, the direct topic of my PhD, but it was something that I was interested in, and the Global Revolutions Project in Queen's University Belfast had held a kind of PhD symposium that summer, and I saw the call for papers, and I thought, right, I know what gap needs to be filled there. So I took that as my invitation, I suppose, to start working a little bit on I suppose, emigration of female revolutionaries. And I suppose as soon as I started, I realised that this was something that was enormous. And I think my chapter really is only an invitation for more research on this area. From my own point of view, the reason that I was interested in this was because I spent a year in Springfield, Massachusetts as a Fulbright scholar. My partner is also Irish American, from descendant of Civil War veteran immigrants. So there was that history, I suppose, that I was very much aware of, and aware of Irish America. And I suppose I also work in an Irish language setting, and emigration is such a key feature of everything we do in terms of Irish language work. So it really was a no-brainer that this was something that needed to be covered in terms of the Irish Revolution. So really what this chapter does, I suppose, it's a starting point. It's a recuperation of testimony, as many testimony. I was interested in looking at different forms of testimony and maybe breaking down some of the boundaries of what usually is conceived of as testimony, and then looking at this testimony to consider how these, I suppose, personal subjectivities are created in the diasporic space, that particularly within the diaspora, where there is this very male trope of exile. So how do women present themselves around this? How do they negotiate that? And that's something I'm still trying to tease out. And what I was really interested to see was how their narratives shift how they convey themselves differently in very different contexts, and how I suppose that trope of exile is not always appropriate necessarily to their situation. And this taps in, I think, to much broader research. I know Jennifer Redmond is here as well, but obviously there is a huge narrative of female immigration from Ireland. It's something that was originally, I suppose, overlooked in many of the historical studies, and that's only been something that's continuing to be redressed. From going through the nominal rolls, I was able to name over 2,000 women in Cumann who had emigrated. There's many more, no doubt. But it really does bring up the question of where do we go next. I think we have the research we have the files from the military archives that will give us huge insights into immigration. We have the nominal rolls. We can then cross-reference with other files. But I think really what we need to think of is maybe more local histories on the ground. And I should just say that most of the 2,000 women that I was able to identify in the nominal rolls, I don't have the figure off the top of my head, but I think 80%, over 80%, it could have been 85%, went to the US. So just to put it in that perspective, and that kind of tallies with the general scholarship. So the majority are going to the States, and then obviously some are making their way to Australia, and Dianne will be able to talk to that, but that was only the minority during this period anyway. And I think maybe with the online platforms, maybe that's something that will open up even more. One of the interesting things about doing all of these online lectures is I think I did a lecture a few months ago and I was introduced to Dianne through that. So we'd already met because of this online, the accessibility of online lectures, and maybe that's something that will open up more research in the diaspora. One of the aspects, or so I suppose the elements that's maybe problematic with the global idea is that sometimes you need the local histories to support the global. And I think particularly from what I can see in Irish America, that there is a very striking neglect of studies, I suppose, of women in Irish America on a local level. So maybe that's something that can be promoted going forward. And we really need people to come from, I suppose, for it to be bottom-up history, and to see how these women's experiences were passed down through generations within their local communities in the States and on a more local level. And then the last thing I'll just say is that LauraMcAtackney referred to Brady Halpen there, who obviously features in my chapter as well. Really striking story, I suppose, that epitomizes the silence, I suppose, of revolutionary women, in that after her death in New York, her family discovered her papers and realized that she'd been interned, and this is something that I'd never passed on. And when I was working on this paper, that was something that became very, very personal to me, because going through the records and writing out my Excel sheet of 2,000 women, I discovered my great aunt on that list who had emigrated to New York, who I never realized was in Cumann. Her activism had never been passed down, but I'd heard of her many times growing up because of her sending money home from New York, where she worked in the domestic service for most of her life. So I suppose that just brought up a whole other question of, I suppose, the subjectivity of the research. In any research we do, how do we separate ourselves from what we're doing, and how that denial and that silence is a very prominent feature of all of this history. So on that note, I'll pass over to Dianne.
Thanks very much. And thanks, join my thanks with everyone else for Oona's fabulous job in putting this collection together. And thank you very much for the invitation to contribute. I suppose my jumping off point for this paper, this article that I wrote, was that I was involved in organising the 2016 St Bridget's Day festivities, Bridget Fest here in Melbourne, and what we did with the support of money from the Irish Embassy through the Irish government for the commemoration was to host a talk by a Dublin woman, Maeve O'Leary, about her grandmother, who had been in the GPO during the in 1916. One of the really interesting things about that was the reaction of the audience. We had a sellout audience, about 120 people. Some of them had emigrated from Ireland up to decades before. Others were just interested, and many had Irish heritage. many of them were saying, we didn't know about this. We didn't know anything about this. We didn't learn this at school. Our families haven't talked about this. The Irish Australian organisations we might have been involved in have never talked about these women. And they were all quite indignant, really, that they didn't know about this, about the involvement of women like Maeve's grandmother, which is one thing that sort of sparked me off in looking at the way that Australians of Irish heritage or who have migrated to Australia from Ireland have remembered the Irish revolutionary women in the 100 years since 1916. So I went to look for those who had Irish revolutionary women themselves who had migrated, and as Síobhra said, there's very few, but I did trace a few, and I think there's more, and I think that there's definitely scope for much more research to be done. Quite a number of these women have faded into obscurity. We know nothing about them. They were quite content to start their lives anew and didn't connect at all, it seems, with any Irish Australian organisations or with their with trying to get a pension or anything like that. Of the few who did, I think the whole process of applying for a pension from so far away, and it was so difficult to get in touch with old comrades, to find out addresses, to do all of the work, which is essentially memory work in itself, to put all that information together, testified to a deep commitment to both the money, and for some of them it was incredible, the money was very important, but also to recognition for their own roles and for themselves and for their children. Mayo Carroll is one of the more well-known ones, who I think has been mentioned in a number of the articles for this collection, and she did work very hard to get her pension and involved quite a lot of memory work, if you like, of recalling what she had done, ordering it and getting her daughter and people in Dublin to make sure she got her pension. But it's not only the women themselves who migrated. One of the things I also looked at was the way that people from about the 1960s and 70s, Irish Australians with heritage going back to the 19th century, reconnected with their Irish past, and in doing so found connections with Irish revolutionary women that they were surprised about, that they didn't know about. It wasn't part of their family stories, but because of their connection with Irish history and their interest in the revolution themselves, followed that up. And that's another thread, if you like, that I explored in this article. One of the things that I'd like to say is there's far more research to be done in the Irish diaspora in Australia and in transnational history, linking the diasporas, which is very difficult, which is really hard work. And the only way that that's possible is through the digitalisation of records. A number of people have mentioned that from this far away, finishing off this article with while I was in lockdown, actually, with no access to anything, digitalisation was the only thing that made it possible. Both the digitalisation of the military archives in Ireland, but also the digitalisation of Australian newspapers in a wonderful initiative of the National Library of Australia, which meant that these women's activities could be traced through local newspapers. So with the digitalisation of more records in different diasporic locations, hopefully we'll be able to expand our knowledge of these women, their descendants, and the way they've been remembered. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. I think what strikes me again and again, listening to both of you, is the actual labour that goes into this kind of work in a very different way from the kind of grand narratives of history that we all are familiar with and that we inherit so naturally, it seems. And yet the labor that it takes to establish these other narratives is massive and continues to be massive, and perhaps will be made slightly easier because of digitalization projects, but remains something that will require tremendously hard work. And again, I think it's a testament to the kind of research that is going on that shows you just how labor intensive this is. So thank you both so much for that. And again, I'd like to come back to questions at the end that hopefully we can tie all of these things together. For our final panel today, we have Ellie Davies and Brenda O'Connell kindly agreed to take on the task, which I think is a tricky one, to consider the present moment. And I think this was a hard ask in this volume, and I think they fulfilled it, of course, brilliantly. So thank you both so much for agreeing to speak today. I don't know which of you would like to go ahead, but please feel free to go ahead.
I think Brenda, were you going to go first?
I'll go first, yeah. And thank you. It's really an honour for me to be among such distinguished scholars, and to thank Oona. I think I remember I was coming down the staircase in Maynooth one day towards the department, and Oona was walking past, and she opened the door and said, "Brenda, I need an essay on Waking the Feminists and I want you to write it." So I was absolutely honoured. I was one of the lucky few who got a ticket for the Waking the Feminist famous, iconic now, meeting in November 2015, where for once there was only one man in the audience, and that was the director at the time, Fiach McConnell. And so I was speaking to Ellie earlier on about the crossover between both of our own essays, and I just noticed that we had touched on the tricky subject of motherhood in Northern Ireland for Ellie, and in my own work on women in Irish theatre, and how mother artists are significantly impacted, have been, until the Waking the Feminist movement. And I just want, well, it's difficult in some ways to talk about what the present issues are with no live performances and everything on hold. So from that point of view, it's difficult to talk about the issues at the moment. But in terms of the development and impact of the Waking the Feminist movement, which I traced in my chapter, and then I looked also at an advocacy organisation called MAM, M-A-M, MAM for short, Mothers, Artists, Makers, which I think is a really important group, a small but significant group. I also then traced academic work, which is recovering Irish, forgotten again, Irish women playwrights. And then I looked at the restaging of Teresa Davies' well-known play, Katie Roach, which was staged in 2017 as a direct result of the lack of women playwrights. So when I was looking at, I wanted to talk about the Mothers, Artists, Makers group, as I say, because I do think within the Waking the Feminist movement that there is already potentially that they'll get forgotten about because they're such a small group and most people have never heard of them. So they were formed famously at the Waking the Feminist meeting in the Abbey outside. An artist called Tara Derrington had a placard saying, "Where are the disappeared women of theatre, ... at the school gates now." And that image was beamed around social media quite substantially. And that basically started the seeds of this group called Mothers, Artists, Makers. So it is a small group. They're described as having small boots, but taking big strides. And they have a closed group on Facebook. And I was having a look at the weekend because they're 5 years old, and they had a number of testimonials from various women as, the impact and how it's helped them. And I just came across one, which I just wanted to quote from. And it's a woman called Helen Adams, who's a teacher and a writer. And she posted at the weekend that she's a finalist for a short screenplay award. It's the Catalyst International Film Festival. And she's one of 7 finalists, 6 of which are women, thank God. And her short screenplay is Butterfly Mountain. But on the group, she just had a lovely post, and I just wanted to read it out. And she says, "A few words of gratitude. I know deep into my aching motherly bones that without Waking the Feminists and without MAMs, I would not have had the courage or self-belief to think that I could write anything again, let alone a screenplay." So I think it's really important that somebody like Helen Adams is now a finalist for a short screenplay, and she directly acknowledges that without the Waking the Feminist movement and without the group MAMs, that it just simply would not have happened. So the aim of MAMs is, as they say, to find pathways back to practice for women artists who happen to be mothers. So they find it even more difficult. And they ask all the time, who is missing? And they said they will keep asking the question, who is missing, until everybody has an opportunity, every woman, artist, mother has an opportunity to fulfill their potential. And so reading Linda Connolly's essay, and I wanted to borrow something she talked about of what-ifism, which she says a term that was coined by Ronan Fanning. But Linda Connolly said about the fact that women would never have been written into history if what-if questions were not asked by pioneering women historians and feminist scholars from the 1980s onwards. So to link that to women's work in theatre, we need, as women, to challenge, as regards theatre, we need to challenge our own unconscious bias when it comes to turning up for women's work. So maybe if we took the question, what if we turned up more for women's work? What if we, as Melissa Síobhra says, we tilted the lens? Melissa Síobhra writes a lot on Lady Gregory, and she wants to establish Gregory as the foundation, like a matriarchal lineage, who was a precursor for all the male playwrights that came after her. So she talks about this idea of tilting the lens to re-establish a foundational status of Irish women in theatre. But in order for that to happen, we need to, as Kathy Leaney says, we need to challenge our own unconscious bias, especially as women, towards women's theatre, and that we need to embrace what she calls new ways of seeing. So I think the what if is really important. As I said, it is hard to know what's happening at the moment because there's nothing happening at the moment, but there has been massive impact of the Waking the Feminists, without forgetting to mention the Me Too movement and how Michael Colgan got, we all know what happened there, and there was a report into all of that. So it's all caught up in the Waking the Feminists and the really important impact that it's had. And in terms of my own work, in terms of academic research on recovery of Irish women playwrights, there is a forthcoming 2 volumes called The Golden Thread, Irish Women Playwrights from 1716 to 1916. And that is due out on July 1st. And that, like this publication, will also aim to address a significant gap. There's playwrights I never heard of myself in it. And so this should impact on what is taught on the curriculum. Melissa Síobhra wants to completely throw the curriculum out. So this publication should have an impact on what is taught. And also there's so many other forgotten Irish women playwrights of that time period who, so as it has been said here, there's so much more research to be done on all of this. So that's really all I wanted to say about my own work, and that all of these publications are going to make such an impact on what's taught, who's in, who's out, whose story gets told, as Oona said. But I think, again, it's so important that, women's work in theatre can be, it doesn't conform to a masculine aesthetic. So therefore it's seen as kind of messy, or it looks like women don't know what they're talking about. And Anne Enright has talked about this, the fact that men praise other men, whether it's literature or plays, and then you get this spiraling of male affection. I mean, I think Anne Enright very funnily said that if a male author writes, "The cat sat on the mat," that it's, oh my God, this is the most amazing thing a man has ever said. Whereas if a woman says that, it's, well, we know what happens there. So that's really what I just wanted to talk about. And hopefully when things open up again and live performances happen again, that the momentum isn't lost on this, but it definitely isn't, and we can only look forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Kelly, do you want to go ahead?
Thanks, Brenda. Yes, just to begin again by echoing everybody else's tributes to Oona and your work on the volume. Also, I mean, it's really exciting for me to be included in this volume alongside scholars whose work has been really important to my research as well. So that's great. And it felt really important for me to be able to talk about the North of Ireland in the context of these discussions that are happening about commemoration. And I know that my chapter deals with a slightly different historical period. And it takes as its starting point the 50th anniversary commemorations of the civil rights movement, the so-called beginning of the civil rights movement in 1968. And I'm kind of looking at the general importance of remembering the home in the context of the histories of the North of Ireland and the civil rights movement, the Troubles and so on. Partly I'm focusing specifically on the activism of a group of women called the Homeless Citizens League, who organised around the issue of housing discrimination, housing justice in Dungannon in 1963, and which kind of predated what we think of, or what is commonly thought of, as civil rights. There are very kind of dominant images that people have of the civil rights movement, which is largely the kind of rows of men in suits marching under the banner, under the banners demanding one man, one vote, and all of these things. So the women of the Homeless Citizens League, the HCL, partly what they were doing was mobilising specifically around their roles as mothers and carers, which I argue is actually a really deeply radical act, because what it's doing is bringing these roles, the idea of these roles, is challenging the idea of these roles as somehow beyond politics, beyond public discourse, and it's making it a part of what politics is and what it means. Obviously, Brenda's already talked about the theatre activists who talked about the importance of recognising motherhood in the context of theatre and being artists. But it's also about making these experiences, that is, the experiences of the home and domestic space, partly what we think about as private, part of what we think of as history. These are histories. These are the histories of the North of Ireland as a whole. This is politics, and I think this is really crucial kind of argument to make. There's also an agency at play here. Often women's domestic roles are talked about as kind of auxiliary, supporting the main business of what's happening outside the home. But there is an agency within this, and I think Linda Connolly talked at the beginning about the idea of agents. There's agency and experience, and that definitely applies to the experiences of what was happening to women within the home. And women like the Homeless Citizens League, who used those experiences to kind of try and organise for fairer housing. Partly the point of my chapter really is and it's an argument posed by the collection as a whole, and all the essays really, I suppose, is that a lot of the forms of commemoration that we see, and they're often, of course, linked to official state narratives, are often not really adequate for representing these more complex feminist histories. They're about singular events, singular figures, and I guess if we're thinking about present issues, this kind of comes up again in discussions about commemoration of partition, which of course is being discussed a lot at the moment, and how this is done. And often partition is talked about as if it was a singular event that just happened. There was a parliament that was opened, and that was somehow what partition means, rather than actually something that exists, that still exists. The partition is a reality. It's an experience that we are kind of living with all the time, and it shapes the experiences of our everyday lives. And at the moment, I'm thinking particularly of the issue of reproductive rights in the North, which is definitely shaped by partition. The anomalous position of women in the North is partly to do with that. And many of you will know about what happened last week with the DUP bringing a bill which sought to further restrict women in Northern Ireland, restrict their access to reproductive health care, and Sinn Féin abstained on it. So what we saw here was a kind of classic example of what is thought of as politics, what is thought of, what are thought of as important issues in Northern Ireland, which are shaped by this kind of power play between these two binary forces. It kind of excludes the everyday experiences, the things that shape women's lives. And I suppose I argue in my chapter and in my work generally that if you look at the home, examining what happens in everyday life, people have, many of the speakers this evening have already talked about the politicisation of the everyday. If you look at the home, it enables, and think about this as part of our politics, part of our histories, it enables this focus on things like reproductive justice, but also things like class, like poverty, like mental health, all of these things which the North really desperately needs to address and the North's politicians need to address. And if we make those a part of our histories and what we think of and what we want to remember about the past as well, then that is really important, and that can really, really change how things unfold in the present. And I suppose that's sort of my contribution to this ongoing discussion, and all of the essays in this book kind of are part of that discussion as well. So I guess that's the note I'm going to end on.
Thank you so much, Ellie and Brenda. I mean, I'm staggered listening to you all. It kind of brings back just how inspiring each of these essays was to work with over the last couple of years. So thank you all so much for talking so articulately. And also, I think we should be really proud of ourselves for speaking so briefly and getting through such a body of material, you know, in such a fast period of time. And I hope that we managed to provide those listening today with a sense of the book. We do have some time for questions or interactions between panelists. I know also that there are a few contributors who are kind of lurking, just listening in the audience. So Sonja or Eve, if you'd like to jump in at some point, please just unmute yourselves and speak up. So we can open it as well to those listening if anybody has any questions. I know, Linda, you had noted a question earlier on in relation to Margaret's discussion as well about, I'm just scrolling back to find it, in relation to the plans for the conference in 2018 and wondering why that was dropped. Linda, do you want to follow up on that?
I was just curious, the commemoration, Margaret, you were talking about, was there a reason why it was dropped, or did it just drop organically?
I really don't know, because I don't know the ins and outs of ministers and civil servants down there. Leanne Bell and I think somebody else were all invited to speak from our different kind of disciplines to artists who would be invited to submit a proposal, and it was cancelled once because the minister couldn't make it, and then it was postponed again, and we were told we'd be informed, and I've never been informed. Now, I have seen calls, funding calls to people in the artistic community for across a range of disciplines, you know, in terms of commemoration generally, but the specific in terms of women being dropped, and I really don't know what the internal dynamics are on that. It could just be a change of government, coalition government, you know, something like that.
Actually, I now that you talk about it, Margaret, I do recall that. And it was supposed to be along the lines that had happened in the lead up to the commemoration in 2016, where there were a number of these consultative meetings held all around the country with activists, artists, academics. I think the Countess Markievicz Award is something that came out of those considerations. But those meetings were never held, and obviously there was no discussion about a suffrage statue or some sort of commemorative thing along the lines of what they've done in Britain. But yeah, those meetings weren't held, just dropped.
Can I pose a question to all of you that I've been thinking about? I'm sure that we've all been seeing a lot of news in the past year about the ways in which the pandemic is affecting academic research and, of course, creative output as well, as Brenda pointed out. And I'm wondering what you think the impact of that will be on the momentum that I felt, at least, we had been gaining in some ways during that period. And Finnuala, you mentioned feeling, a little bit less hopeful than you were when you finished the essay. And I'm wondering, do we think that the pandemic is going to kind of bring us back from the places that we were in potentially a year and a half ago or 2 years ago? Is anybody concerned about that in terms of the effect on research? We're already seeing, for instance, that women in the home, again, to go back to a lot of the work, and particularly Ellie's, the ways in which work is being affected in the home. And I'm just wondering if any of you have that concern or are seeing it in any of the research that you've been doing.
Yeah, I think it is going to impact in some ways. Obviously, I only have 2 cats to look after, so it isn't impacting me in terms of my caring duties, but access to archives. Now, having those digital archives has been fantastic, and being able to do a deep dive into those over this period. But really, in terms of looking for women, because you have to layer it so much, because there aren't any, a woman's archive and this is where you go and that's where everything is. You have to do such detailed research and searching and coming at it from the side, that having those archives closed where you pick up those bits and pieces has really delayed publication and research. And I do worry a little bit about what impact this is going to have on what had been a sort of flowing decade of women's and gender histories. Starting, I recall in 2013, if you recall, Margaret, we all got very exercised about a manel that was being held in which 4, I think, major scholars of the revolutionary period, all men, were invited to discuss the revolutionary period, including women's contribution. And we all did a very public call out of that. I worry that that will go back to that again, particularly as we come into the Civil War. And Civil War being really seen as brother against brother, and Cumann getting sidelined in all sorts of ways, or the women getting sidelined in all sorts of ways in the immediate, as it happened then, because they were seen as the unmanageable, ungovernable revolutionaries, but also where do they fit in this sort of brother against brother narrative? And so much more work needs to be done on that as well. And access to the archives is definitely delaying that work. Or lack of access to the archives, rather.
I see a question here from Deirdre McBride, wondering whether the panelists think that there was anything substantial on remembering of women during the representation of the People programmes in 2018 in Northern Ireland or in Ireland. Don't know if anybody knows or wants to come in on that.
Anything memorable?
No, the question says, was there anything substantial on remembering of women?
Oh, well, Stormont, the Stormont Commission organised symposia, etc., but it was always couched in a way that was kind of almost apolitical, which was like, don't mention the war kind of thing. So, they did do it, but it was very sort of carefully circumscribed, and it was kind of diluted as well, because I spoke at a few things, but quite often you'd have a woman who was, for example, a pundit on football. I don't mean women's football, but just a pundit on football who appeared on, British television. So you'd have women who had achieved in non-traditional areas. So it was much more about that, and not really about looking at what did women do, what is citizenship, what is commemoration, what are the difficulties that women experience. They really were uncomfortable if you looked at suffrage, for example, and tried to explain the different divisions and constitutional positions, for example, that women had, and that isn't really, they wanted something much more bland. And I think that a lot of, I mean, I talk in my chapter about various events, but I think the difficulty with Winifred Carney sums up a lot of the problems in how you commemorate in a society that's so deeply divided.
Yeah, Linda, do you want to come in there? I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that everybody is exhausted and very tired, but I think a lot of what is coming out now, the recent books, they're based on research that has been ongoing for, in some of our cases, 4 or 5 years. So they're you know, a lot of the solid, I think, archival research has been done since 2016 with a view to moving towards the decade of, you know, towards the latter part of the decade. And so I think in that sense, a lot of what we see now is the careful, critical questioning that needed to happen in the context of women and the commemoration. And I think we have to remember it is a state commemoration. A lot of, I think now, we have to, you know, in the midst of all this, the Mother and Baby Homes Commission report, for instance, was published. And, you know, I could go on, but, you know, the impact of the pandemic on our research, etc., is another aspect of that. But I think it's very important, and I think what you achieve, Oona, is you allow us to interweave those present day concerns that are about past injustices, but that, you know, that there is a lot of work now has been done and can move forward in terms of disrupting that sort of Rankian interpretation of the past as something hermetically sealed of its time, because there are far too many injustices in the present, particularly as we saw with the Mother and Baby Homes, the report of the Commission. So I'm quite hopeful is the wrong word, because these are terrible abuses of power. But on the other hand, I do think all of this work will move us into a different kind of discussion, I think, about, you know, as you know, the term I use in my own chapter, historical accountability, and the way in which a very rigorous interpretation of past injustices can actually serve to address some of those dark aspects of our past in the present. So I suppose hopeful is the wrong word, but you know, I think we do have a lot to move forward with in terms of commemoration, not just a state commemoration, but a discourse about those abuses of power.
Yeah, and I think one of the advantages, right, of immersing yourself in anything to do with commemorative discourse is that you do become aware of this sliding scale of time, that there's never anything that's hermetically sealed in the past. You know, that as Guy's work shows us, you know, that there are also these kind of ruptures, things can come back, you know. So there is this sense, I think, for all of us in the book, and this is why the essays work so well for me together, is that there is that sense of how things move in and out. I mean, even voices move in and out of these chapters, which I think both scholarship and the women's voices themselves, right? That's the kind of the beauty of this as well. Margaret, I see you have your hand up as well. Margaret, you're still muted there.
Thank you. Don't want to monopolise the discussion, but I just wanted, Deirdre McBride asked the question about the North. The other thing just to say is, of course, we've got the centenary of partition, and that's really very problematic at the moment. Not being able to access the archives makes it difficult as well, but I find it extraordinary, and it says something about Ulster Unionism, that 2 women were elected to the Northern Irish Parliament in 1921, and yet one of them, it's almost impossible to get a photo of, and the only photo I could get was from a British suffrage newspaper, which was actually from 1928, congratulating her on becoming Belfast High Sheriff. There's nothing that I can see in terms of recognition of Ulster Unionist women and Parliament. So there's a whole new area as the 26 counties, in a sense, focuses more on the Civil War. We in the North are focusing more on partition and its impact and the role women had from various different backgrounds. So just to say, there's a fascinating, almost another volume to be produced.
Several, I'd say, if any of you want to volunteer. Oh, Laura, I see you have your hand up for the next volume, right?
Yes, I was just going to follow on from Margaret because I thought it was a great point about these different memories in different places, because, you know, obviously North and South, the two main binaries, but there's also geographically, Ireland has very different memories in lots of different places of what happened and how we remember different, you know, facets of identity. But that's one thing I think is really important, that we're constantly moving between the present and the past with these commemorations. So whatever's changing in the present with partition, with Brexit, all these other pandemic, is going to completely change what we're looking at in the past as well. And we have to be aware of that so we don't lose the focus as well on what women did.
Absolutely. I don't think we're going to get to all of the questions in the chat. That's the unfortunate thing about an event like this and managing to get you all in one place. But I'm also conscious that we've already gone a half an hour over time. And I know it's getting later in Denmark and in Melbourne, but probably everybody needs to get on with other things in their lives at this stage. And I've certainly taken up enough of all of you as collective authors time already. So I'll just end by saying thank you all so much for your contributions once again, and for being so generous tonight to share your work with everybody here, and also to everybody who joined us this evening. Again, it seems like from all over the world. We're really grateful. And again, just to give a shout out to Eve and Sonja, who were two more contributors who were here this evening, but just didn't feel like speaking, which is absolutely fair enough, but just to acknowledge that they are also joining us tonight. So thank you all so much. I hope we have the opportunity to do this again, and hopefully to raise an actual toast when it's not water on a school night or coffee for Diane, or maybe some of you are having a hot chocolate at this stage for bedtime. But I hope we do have a chance to raise a glass together at some point in the future. So thank you all so much.